Okay, we continue on with the topic of the general distribution of the Sabbath-keeping churches, and we're up to the next section, which is the Albigensian Crusade. All right, Wade?
Yes, well, this is the Albigensian Crusade was in southern France, and it began. They were protected under the Count of Toulouse, Raymond VI, Count of Toulouse. They were given free rein by Raymond. What happened was that the equerry of the Pope, Pierre de Castelnau was his name. The equerry excommunicated Raymond over his protection of the Waldensians and Albigensians. Indirectly, also the Cathars were one of the three groups that were given fair protection. An equerry of Raymond later killed Pierre de Castelnau, and then the Pope immediately then deposed Raymond, and he was frightened into submission and did penance. But this whole structure was extremely important, and in the Albigensian Crusades there was nothing honourable about the conduct of the mainstream system. They killed these people, they killed the Albigensians, took their money, their wealth and lands, and they used the cathedral was built on all of the stolen funds of the people. And it's important that we understand that's what happened. And Raymond did public penance on the 18th of June 1209 before the church at St. Gilles. Now, when the Crusaders are assembled in the north of France, invaded Languedoc, Raymond assisted the crusade and assisted in the siege of Béziers and Carcassonne in 1209. Returning to Toulouse, he avoided his obligation and was excommunicated by the Council of Avignon. So what they used was the full might of the church was used to suppress the Sabbatarian church in France.
Right.
Raymond, there was a lot of machinations. Raymond went to Rome, was received by Innocent III, and they tried to come to a solution, but his estates were overrun. That was all done under Simon de Montfort. In 1212, he held only Toulouse and Montauban, and his brother-in-law, Peter, King of Aragon, came to his aid, but was killed in the Battle of Murat in 1213. This is not minor stuff. You've got the King of Aragon coming to the aid of his brother, Raymond VI of Toulouse, and then gets killed, and these are massive battles fought by warring factions and nobles at the instigation of the ministry of the church, who then seized the assets of anyone who was declared a heretic that simply wanted to obey the Bible. It was that serious.
Right.
And it is so today. If you want to obey the Bible, you'll have every single obstacle they can stick in front of you. They'll try and destroy your careers, your organisations, everything, because that's the way they are, and Satan runs this world, and that will come to an end soon. And those people will find they have a different ruler and a different system, and this biblical system will be enforced. Now, the councils were turned against this structure, and it's important you understand these wars were quite significant, and a lot of the Huguenots were forced out of France as a result of these conflicts also. They came into England. One minor branch of our family came in, were Huguenots who came in from these wars, and they came into England in the 14th century. Many of our people trace their ancestry back to this conflict also. There's some element, one minor branch of your family has got some relationship to these Huguenots, and because they were given refuge in England, and they also went to South Africa. And in South Africa, they developed right through for the South African groups becoming the Boers. And they were different Protestant Huguenot groups also, and Dutch groups that went to South Africa. But others went to Britain, and you'll see them all. Groups in Britain of different families, and they've got French names, and you know that they're Huguenots.
Right. Interesting.
After these battles, you got Raymond VI reassembled his troops and took Toulouse on the 7th of November 1217, and later defended it against Simon de Montfort, who was killed on the 25th of June 1218 CE. And this is the references to this death, his death, is from the Catholic encyclopedias. Everyone's agreed that these things happened. And what we're saying here is taken and supported by articles from the Catholic Encyclopedia and the other historical works. So, Raymond VII was then faced with a new crusade, and he tried to fend it off by offering obeisance to the assembly at Bourges in 1226. But a new crusade was decided upon. Louis VIII ceded rights in the south by Omri de Montfort, seized Avignon and occupied Languedoc without resistance, but died on his return north at Montpensier on the 8th of November 1226. Blanche of Castile did not press the war against Raymond, who then took several places from Imbert de Beaujeu, Seneschal of the King of France. In 1228, new bands of crusaders began pillaging Toulouse, and soon Raymond lost nearly all of his strongholds and had to sue for peace from Blanche of Castile after the Conference of Meaux. And Raymond returned to Paris and did public penance on the 12th of April 1229. These structures are not minor things. You've got the kings of Spain, kings of Castile and of Aragon fighting for and against the Albigensians. And you've got the king of France fighting against the Albigensians in the different stages of this conflict. So this is no minor thing. This is the whole of France and Spain becoming involved in these wars, and the wars were simply to crush the Sabbatarian churches. That's what it was all about.
Right.
And these were your predecessors, your ancestors in many cases, but certainly your predecessors in the faith. They were the ones who kept the Sabbath on the new moons and the feasts. They kept the laws of God and the testimony of Christ. These were the saints of God. The Cathars are a different question. They were holding some things different to the church, but they were both considered enemies of the Catholic system, faith as they understood it. So these wars were simply to crush any organisation that moved against them.
Well, I was going to say, part of their plan was to take the Bible away from everybody too, wasn't it,
Yes.
at that point?
Yes. Certainly, these people confiscated Bibles. You had to read Greek or Latin. Most people did understand Latin, and some read Greek, but to the average person in the street didn't read, wasn't literate enough to read Greek and Latin.
Right.
So they took the Bibles, they banned the Bibles in the vernacular, so our people couldn't read them. They studied Latin anyway. They read the Bible, It was because of this conflict arising and spreading through to the Swiss, they began printing. With the invention of the printing press, they began printing Bibles in native languages and then spreading them into England, through into France, and around Europe. Now, just remember this. The religious authorities, the bishops of England and the bishops of Britain, in Scotland and in Ireland and Wales, began purchasing and burning these Bibles as they came in. The Geneva Bible and the other different Bibles before the King James. There was 150 to 200 years of these Bibles coming in to Britain. And then the King James Version became the popular Bible, but they were losing the battle and stopping the Bibles coming in. But even though the Bibles, some of them from the Textus Receptus, had these forged texts in them, they were still able to be read by the populace. And the bishops of Britain and Europe would try and buy up all of the Bibles and burn them. And that didn't stop. What it did do, what these brainless individuals did, was actually create an economy of scale for the printing presses in Geneva and Switzerland generally, so that they could afford to keep churning these Bibles out. And in the end, the church realised they couldn't stop it. It was all of the religious system tried to stop the people from understanding through the Bibles what was happening. So they tried to stop us reading the Bible and keep us in the dark.
Right, keep us all ignorant so they can brainwash their edicts from Rome.
At this stage, they were teaching the earth was flat.
Right.
And that the sun revolved around the earth. And that the whole world was created 4,000 years ago. That is, 6,000 years ago. They were in 4004 BC, according to the Ussher chronology. But they were forced to allow the Bibles to go right throughout Europe. They were still trying to kill everybody from here onwards, and they were still hanging people in Britain in 1611 for denying the Trinity. And they stopped hanging our people in Britain in 1640s to 1649. But that's how late it was. They were still hanging us for denying the Trinity as late as 1649. And if they had the power to do so now, they'd hang us again. They'd still be hanging us. But the reason, and the general populace saw how absurd, insane it was. And they tried then to stop the hangings, and they did. And then the Reformation occurred, that is, during the Reformation forced them to stop it. And then the reorganisation, from the Reformation, we received Abraham's blessings. And those 400 years of unmerited blessings of Abraham ended in December of 2023.
Right.
Now, you've got there, what we've done is listed the history of the Sabbatati and the Pasaginians of Pasagini. We've listed the declarations against the Albigensians and the Waldensians, that is the Sabbatati, the councils and the declarations by the Catholic system, the Trinitarian system against the Church. And this has been a constant battle, and it's most important that we realise these Trinitarians have tried since the Trinity was brought in, which became the mainstream system through force of arms, has tried to kill the Sabbatarian church system throughout the world whenever it could. And if they could do so today, they would again. All of that will come to an end very soon, and they will cease to exist when the Messiah gets here. But the beast system, we've dealt with that in the beast. Papers on World War III, number 299A and 299B. The Empire of the Beast and the Whore and the Beast. Now, this system of the New World Order that's coming in over the next 3.5 to 4 years will turn against this religious whore, the Sunday, Christmas and Easter keeping system, and they will stamp it out. It's not God that's going to do that. He's going to let Satan get away with stamping his own people out. You want to follow Satan? You are going to face the wrath of Satan. Because Satan doesn't want you to exist, and he will try and eliminate all of you. The end of the Crusades and Inquisition, we'll read this one section. After the Crusades, in spite of the Inquisition, the system was still extant. Louis XII, King of France from 1498 to 1515, being informed by the enemies of the Waldensians inhabiting a part of the province of Provence that several heinous crimes were laid to their account, sent the master of requests and a certain doctor of the Sorbonne to make inquiry into this matter, and on their return they reported they had visited all the parishes, but could not discover any traces of those crimes with which they were charged. And on the contrary, they kept the Sabbath day, observed the ordinances of baptism according to the primitive church, instructed their children in the articles of the Christian faith and the commandments of God. The king, having heard the report of his commissioners, said with an oath that they were better men than himself or his people. This is from the History of the Christian Church, Volume 2, pages 71 to 72, 3rd edition, London, 1818. So that wraps it up. They were accused of all sorts of crimes, but they were blameless. And they were model citizens. And the Inquisition and the investigators found that they were better men than they themselves. And that's really important. Get that through your head. This church that existed before you was better than you. And just remember that. They didn't keep Hillel. They kept the temple calendar. Now, the extent and distribution of them are dealt with right through this next section, and it is an important organisational structure, how they penetrated the structure throughout Europe, right through into Bulgaria and beyond. It also deals with the Ashkenazi centre at the Pale of Settlement, which extended from the Crimea northwest to the Baltic. And you see the Atlas of Jewish History in that regard and its quotations. So it's important that we understand who we were and are. And these people who worship two gods, who are co-eternal, and keep the Hillel calendar are not the true Church of God. And that's important. Those people are people of the Sardis system, and those the Laodicean system, who worship two gods or three gods, and the groups of the Adventists became Trinitarian through infiltration by the Jesuits, and they became Trinitarian in 1978. That late. So this Sardis and Laodicean systems that exist we'll discuss in our next paper, on paper number 170, the role of the fourth commandment in the historical Sabbath-keeping churches. There will always be differences of opinion, but the Church of God will exist. It's like a flame that burns brighter and lower in various ages, that is, in various centuries. But it still is the Church of God prophesied in Revelation chapter 2 and chapter 3.
Right.
And it's still here. We are doing, in CCG, we are still doing what Christ and the apostles did and the Church of God did right up until the 20th century. We're still doing everything, keeping the Sabbaths and the new moons and the feasts, keeping the temple calendar, keeping the food laws, instructing our families, obeying God as best we can, in spite of the pressure and persecutions we get, where the very economic system tries to stop us and deny us employment. And the people of this system will try and force you into not keeping the system. And they'll resort to all sorts of means of doing that. Now in the next phase, we'll examine the Bosnian Cathars. And this deals with Bosnia, and that goes through Herzegovina and the various areas, and this goes from the 12th century onwards, and it then goes up into Transylvania, and the Sabbatarians in Transylvania were operational fully right through to the end of the 19th century. The Sabbatarians in Transylvania were recorded by Rabbi Cohn, who was the chief rabbi at Buda and Pest, and he wrote the work Die Sabbataria in Siebenbürgen, ihre Geschichte, Literatur und Dogmatik in Budapest, and Verlag von Singer and Wolfe, 1894. Now, this work was only in the German. And what CCG did, we tracked this work down and translated it into English. And we released it in 1998 so that we could see exactly what our predecessors did. And it was a very pleasing thing for us to be able to prove publicly that these Sabbatarians in Transylvania did exactly what CCG does to the letter, and there is no difference. They did not keep the Hillel calendar. They didn't keep Rosh Hashanah. And Rabbi Cohn says that they were the original Christian church before the Hillel calendar was issued. And that system didn't have anything to do with the Judaic practices issued by Rabbi Hillel II and used by Judah. They were totally prior to the Hillel calendar. They kept the temple calendar as we keep the temple calendar. They didn't keep Hillel. In other words, the 20th and 21st century churches of God operating out of the United States and America, that is Canada, Australia, also and New Zealand and Britain, are out of step with the Church of God. They are an era contrary to Christ and the apostles of 1900 years, 19 centuries before. So it's important that you understand who your predecessors were and how you're out of step, because they're not wrong, you're wrong. And if you're keeping Hillel and you've got two gods, you're not in the first resurrection, and you better understand that.
Yeah, what I was going to say, I mean, I know we've said it again, time and time again, but it is so important This is a blueprint for how the church should actually be conducting itself, the true church.
From history, exactly. Yep.
And it shows time and time again, even if there was only a small little group that was keeping it was keeping it the same as CCG is actually keeping it today. Which is in direct contrast to what all those other churches are now keeping.
To the offshoots.
Yeah, they're keeping Hillel, which immediately puts them way out of whack, doesn't it?
Yeah,
And their
puts them in the
condition
second resurrection.
Right.
Yeah, understand that.
And the
you
condition
keep
is-
Hillel, you can do that, but you're going to the second resurrection. We're going to kill all your ministers.
Revelation 2 and 3
Right?
says
Christ, when he gets here, is going to kill your ministry and send you to the second resurrection along with them.
Right.
You might make it into the millennial system alive, but you'll be a human and you'll die in the millennial system.
Right.
It's important. It's that important. You need to understand your history. Now, this goes on in talking about, in Rabbi Cohen's work, we talk also about the hymnals, the old Sabbatarian hymnals. He says the old Sabbatarian hymnal, this contains altogether 102 hymns from diverse devotional occasions, among which not less than 44 are for the Sabbath. In addition, there are 5 songs for the new moon, which they kept, 11 for the feast of the Passover and unleavened bread, 6 for the feast of weeks, 6 for the feast of tabernacles, 3 for the feast of the new year, and 1 for the feast of atonement. That was written thus, that's what they said, for the feast of atonement, the day of atonement, and 26 for the different occasions of everyday life. Cohen translation, page 55. It's a most important situation that we see, and this developed through Simon Pecci took over the Sabbatarians in Transylvania in 1623. There was a specific Judaizing bend that happened from 1638 until 1869, and it was a Judaizing progression in part of the churches in Transylvania, and then the end result of that was for those few groups, or the group that became the Judaizing section, to go into Judaism, and they sought refuge in Judaism rather than put up with the persecutions that they'd put up with for centuries. And they then went into Judaism and began keeping Hillel. That section was a Judaizing bend which was no longer part of the Church of God.
Right.
So look at yourself, and if your organisation is keeping Hillel, you're a Judaizing section of the Church of God, and you are not in the Church of God, my friends. That's the way it is.
They took themselves out. Right.
Yes. Now the next section is the Sabbath in Britain.
Right.
Now this Sabbath in Britain was started under Aristobulus on the 12 hides of land at Glastonbury for the first church. Tertullian says in his text against the Jews, he boasted that the parts of Britain inaccessible to the Romans were indeed conquered by Christ, and that was written about 200 years after the birth of Christ. This is a Trinitarian bishop, Edwards, writes this in Christian England, volume 1, page 20. So it's not as though there's disagreement that Tertullian is writing saying they'd long had Christianity in Britain in the year 200. So they all know, and we know, Hippolytus told us that Aristobulus left his family at Rome and went on to Britain.
Right.
And established the church in Britain sometime between 35 and 38, and it was established through from 40 onwards. So there's nothing mystical about it.
No, like we say, these facts that are in here are actual historical facts.
Yes, and the area of Glastonbury was kept under control of the British for centuries until Einar, king of the West Saxons, 688 to 722, occupied it. Right, so the Celtic Church was in total control of the Church of Glastonbury until Einar, king of the West Saxons, came in 688 to 722. Sometime in that period, around 700, the church area was taken over by the West Saxons, who had become Trinitarian Catholics. They were not part of the Celtic Church in Britain. But he did, in fact, give extensive lands to its clergy, and it survived until it was burnt down. And the date it was burnt in 1184, under the Normans. Right, so the original church established by Aristobulus and the Celtic Church from the first century was burnt down under the Norman Catholics in 1184. Now, the earliest Christian martyr recorded under the Romans in Britain is Alban. He seems to have been a Roman soldier who sheltered a Christian priest escaping from Gaul and was baptised by him. Edwards says this on page 21. Gildas and Bede also tell us of the martyrs Aaron and Julius at Caerleon. Aaron's name suggests that he was a Jew. Edwards, I bet. Now, there were 5 British Christians, including 3 bishops at the Council of Arles in 314. Eborius, Bishop of York, Rostitus, Bishop of London, Adelphius, Bishop of Lincoln. But this is not certain, since the scribe wrote Colonia Londinensium, rather than Colonia Lindenensum. A priest and a deacon were there also, Edwards, I bid. Now, the Emperor Constantine had been declared Augustus or Emperor at York in 25th of July 306 on the death of Constantius, his father. Now, Constantius had been sympathetic to the Christians in Gaul who were subordinationist Unitarian. Constantine had facilitated the Council at Nicaea in 325, and Athanasius records the British bishops there as agreeing with its decrees. That's Athanasius, though. He was of the Athanasian faction, who were the Binitarians. And what happened to the Council of Nicaea is important. They couldn't agree, and Constantine marched a cohort of troops in and occupied the hall that they were discussing or using. And that was in 325. And he ordered that they resolve the issue because he didn't understand. He thought the Athanasian faction was the superior or more numerous faction, but it wasn't. And there were a number of Unitarian bishops exiled and deposed, and by 327 he realized that he had made a terrible error, and these Diotheus Binitarians under the what's called the Athanasian faction now were deposed, and he appointed the Unitarian faction back in charge of the church at Rome and through the Roman system. So the Athanasians, these Catholic Trinitarians, were not in power from Nicaea. The records of Nicaea were burnt and declared erroneous. And the Nicene Creed you got in these Trinitarian churches is a forgery. What they did was, at the Council of Constantinople, when the Trinitarians finally took over and the doctrine of the Trinity was declared, then reconstituted what they declared were the canons of the Council of Nicaea, then established that as the point where the church had become agreed on doctrine, which was a lie.
Right.
And the Council of Nicaea and the Creed of Nicaea is a fiction of the Council of Constantinople of 391. And even then they didn't gain unity, and that went on through until the Council of Chalcedon in 451, when they got finally a Trinitarian doctrine agreed by what they considered to be the most powerful and therefore controlling faction of the church, the Christian church. But these people had ceased to become Christian by that time. They kept Sunday, Christmas, Easter. They were total heretics. They didn't keep the feasts. They didn't keep the new moons. They didn't keep the Passover and unleavened bread. They didn't have the Lord's Supper on a yearly basis at the Passover. They were heretics and ceased to be Christians long before then. They taught that when they died, they went to heaven. That is, some people did. And they taught, many bishops taught that to placate their lay people, their congregations.
Right.
But it's important to note also that this Sabbatarian church in Britain was underground and forced underground from Hilda's Abbey and through to the suppression of the Welsh and Celtic church there, and especially up through until the 11th century under King David. They and the Irish were not able to suppress the Sabbatarian system. And in Britain, as I said in another earlier video, that Adrian IV, who was Nicholas Breakspear, who became Adrian IV, he was British, and he gave Ireland to England in the 12th century. And the purpose of all of that was to suppress Irish religious freedom, because they were all Sabbatarians, they weren't Trinitarians. You see now there's St. Patrick's Day parades and they're all having shamrocks and saying that,
green clothing and funny hats and
and St. Patrick was a Catholic and that's who brought Christianity to Ireland. Absolute codswallop.
Yeah.
Rubbish. It's lies, and always has been. Patrick was a Sabbatarian Unitarian, and he baptised Columcille, St. Columba of Iona, and St. Columba of Iona established the monastery there and spread the church into Scotland under Aidan of Lindisfarne, and they were all Sabbath-keeping, feast-keeping, food law-keeping Sabbatarians. They were not Catholics. And you don't understand your history, you can't see how they've lied to us continually for centuries upon centuries. There is nothing true about what they say concerning the history of the Sabbatarian Church. But this Sabbath-keeping Britain is important for you to understand and to deal with understanding how things transgressed in England, transpired in England, and how they tried to transgress the Sabbath and the system, and how they put the Sabbath down for quite some time. That will change and is changing, and from a small remnant will become, once again, under the Christ, the ruling church in the world. It goes on through past the execution of Charles I and through into the history of the Seventh-day Baptists and some of the references there and the Dutch connection of the Pilgrim Fathers, number 264, and we'll deal with that in another video.
It's interesting, yeah.
Yeah. Northern Europe is then the next area where we talk about the persecutions in Norway. The persecution started at least from the church council in Bergen on the 22nd of August 1435 and the conference in Oslo in 1436. People in different places of the kingdom had commenced to keep the Sabbath day holy, as it never died out. And the problem is just the people kept it secretly. Right. And then it emerged and started to become the most important factor. Also at the provincial council of Bergen in 1435 it was said, "We're informed that some people in different districts of the kingdom have adopted and observed Sabbath keeping. It is severely forbidden in Holy Church canon for one and all to observe days excepting those which the Holy Pope and the Archbishop or the bishops command. Saturday keeping must under no circumstances be permitted hereafter further that the church canon commands. Therefore we counsel all the friends of God throughout all Norway who want to be obedient towards the Holy Church to let this evil of Saturday keeping alone, and the rest we forbid under penalty of severe church punishment to keep Saturday holy." That was the vehemence with which they persecuted those who sought to obey God under the commandments. The fourth commandment deals with the seventh day, Saturday. Right. It doesn't condone Sunday worship of any description anywhere. It will be removed. All that will become a thing of the past. Nobody who keeps Sunday, Christmas and Easter, or anything like it, or who keeps Hillel, will be in the first resurrection. Just understand that. You have to. And then in the second resurrection, where all those people will be sent, they will be resurrected, and we will then commence to teach them the truth. And there will be no Sunday worship on this planet from the next few years onwards, forever. These Sabbath-keeping churches you see right through Sweden, and the histories of Sabbatarianism, they were reissuing warnings. 1544, they issued a warning. "Some of you, contrary to the warning, keep Saturday. You ought to be severely punished. Whoever shall be found keeping Saturday must pay a fine of 10 marks. History of King Christian III, Niels Krag and S. Stephanius." Right, so it's not as though it's all unknown. It's the historical works of the church and the suppression of the true Sabbath-keeping systems by these Sunday worshippers. And that is part of the satanic system. And we'll continue on dealing with all that. This work takes you through all these sequences, through the history, right through and through the 16th century, and the Sabbatarianism had penetrated right through from Liechtenstein and Belgium through to Russia, and was condemned at the Council of Moscow in 1503. It says the accused, that is the Sabbath keepers, were summoned. They openly acknowledged the new, that is, what they stated was a new faith, and defended the same. The most prominent of them, the Secretary of State, Kurizin Ivan Maximo, Cassian Archimandrite of the monastery of Novgorod, were condemned to death and burned publicly in cages at Moscow on December the 19th, 1503. These are the persecution of the saints. These guys were burnt publicly in cages.
That's shocking.
And they were not isolated instances. So just think about your predecessors. What you aspire to be is a member of the saints of the Church of God. These people not only put up with losing jobs or being fined, and 10 marks was a lot of money in those days. It was over a year's wages. But these guys were burnt, and they were burnt all over Europe and Britain. And this practice in Liechtenstein, that was also dealt with. And the Sabbatarian, Wolfgang Capito at Liechtenstein, said the Sabbatarians teach that the outward Sabbath, that is Saturday, must still be observed. They say that the Sunday is the Pope's invention. That's Refutation of the Sabbath, 1599, by Wolfgang Capito. So it goes on and deals with these problems that occurred in the suppression of the Sabbath keepers. And it says here, Armitage and Cox deal with this history of the Baptists, and said in 1310, 200 years before Luther, these, the Bohemian Brethren, constituted 1/4 of the population of Bohemia. These are not isolated individuals. This is over a quarter of the population of Bohemia.
Right.
Were all Sabbath keepers. And that they were in touch with the Waldensians, who abounded in Austria, Lombardy, Bohemia, north of Germany, Thuringia, Brandenburg and Moravia. Erasmus pointed out how strictly Bohemian Waldenses who kept the seventh-day Sabbath. Armitage, A History of the Baptists, page 318, also R. Cox a bit. And the Moravians under Zinzendorf moved from Europe to America in 1741. This is where the Sabbatarianism came from. The Pilgrims in the Netherlands who went from England, from Surrey and other areas across to the Netherlands and then to the establishment at Plymouth Rock, and also the Sabbatarians under Count Zinzendorf in 1738, where he wrote of keeping the Sabbath, that I have employed the Sabbath for rest many years already, and our Sunday for the proclamation of the gospel. So because they were forced to keep their Sabbath privately, so they used the opportunities of Sunday worship for proclaiming the gospel, but they kept the Sabbath privately. Otherwise they would have been killed, and many of them suffered martyrdom for keeping it publicly.
Right.
Yeah, the Sunday became a Bible study, didn't it?
Yes, yes. They used Sunday, and in Britain it went underground to that effect, where Sunday became an open Bible study because that's what they were forced to do. But the Sabbath became a private, personal keeping of God's law.
Right, yeah. It continues the suppression of the Sabbath in the areas of Romania and Czechoslovakia and the Balkans.
Yes, that's correct. They were saying later that the doctrine on the nature of God wasn't clear, and they were persecuted so badly that the whole of the church were Unitarians, but they were underground from the 1700s, and the Reformation which we've dealt with in distinction in the law papers, where we've dealt with all the declarations. And all of the Protestant churches declared that when they believed in the resurrection of the dead. So in the Reformation, if you claimed that there was no resurrection of the dead, you would have been booted out of the church. Right. It was one of the conditions of belief of the Anglican Church, the Methodist Church, all of the Protestant areas. And we've dealt with that in the distinction in the law paper. But all of this is extremely important in understanding what happened. And they suppressed Sabbath keeping continually in the areas of Romania, Czechoslovakia, and the Balkans. In 1789 it was continued, and Joseph II's Edict of Tolerance did not apply to the Sabbatarians. So they have an Edict of Tolerance to the Protestants, but that didn't extend to the Sabbatarians. Mm-hmm. That tells you who the Church of God was. Mm-hmm. And these, we've dealt with these. You're able to also see them from Rabbi Cohn's work, which we've translated. It's now Cohn is Sabbatarians in Transylvania, translated as McElwain and Rook, edited W. Cox, CCG Publishing, USA, 1998. The church in Romania and Hungary under Andreas Iossi from 1588 was denied use of the printing press and had to publish its material by a system of hand duplication. This church existed in Transcarpathia and Romania, chiefly in Oluj and Sibiu, around 1894, and was Sabbatati, termed Sabbataria. The suffix aria seems to indicate Arian, because they were Unitarians, so they were labelled Arians. Right. And that's what the German word Sabbataria seems to indicate. Mm-hmm. These people are extant now in the Ukraine and the area to the north of the 1894 locations, and they were Unitarians. We believe they still are Unitarians, but some of them have lapsed into this grape juice taking heresy at the Lord's Supper, and we'll deal with that on another area. And also that there's another Christian tradition dealt with in this text, which is the fact of the birth of Christ. It was not the 25th of December, and the early tradition of the church was that Christ was born around the Feast of Tabernacles, and that's dealt with in Brady's Clavis Calendaria, and 1 and 2, London, 1812, pages 313 to 314. Now, the Empire of 1260 days is the next section in this. This deals with the Holy Roman Empire from 590 by declaration of Gregory I. That went through for 1260 days, at times and half a times in years. 1260 days, 1260 years. And this was 1260 years from 590 to 1850. From 1823 to 1846, the last Inquisition in the Papal States was conducted. Many thousands were killed. There was a gallows on every corner of the Palatinate of the Papal States. People were hanged on a regular basis. And this is in 1823 to 1846. This is not centuries upon centuries ago. It's 180 years ago, and they were hanging them on the street corners in Rome. Now, this is not a fiction. And you'll see the Catholic historian, Malachi Martin, writes about this persecution. Now, I've dealt with this and documented it all, and all the references are there for you to check. It'll show you what happened, and it stopped in 1846, and in 1850 the revolutions in Europe occurred. And what happened then was that the Italians ordered the referendum in the Papal States. And out of all the hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people in the Papal States, they managed to get 3,500 people to vote to stay under the Vatican. Everyone else unanimously voted to get rid of the Vatican and get rid of the system and go in under the Republic of Italy. Under Garibaldi. That's what you're dealing with.
Yep.
And then the empire was finished.